All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to CHRTC 309, Sociology of Youth and Religion. All right, so in this next series of lectures, what we're going to be talking about is the nuns, right? So this category of nothing in particular. Who are they? The nothing in particular is the people who identify as religiously unaffiliated. What are their characteristics? What do they actually believe? Is it, non-religion, atheism, and the like? We will dig deeply into that over the next few lectures here. Okay, so for this lecture, and the first part of it anyway, we're going to be looking at a lot of information from this book, which is None of the Above, Non-Religious Identity in the US and Canada, by Joel Thiessen and Sarah Wilkins Laflamme. So both of these are Canadian professors. Joel is a professor over at Ambrose University in Calgary. Sarah is a professor at University of Waterloo. And they are, in terms of Canadian work on religion, I would say the best in the business. Okay, so who are the nuns, right? So according to Thiessen and Wilkins Laflamme, basically when we look at the nuns in Canada and the US, they refer to most of them as non-verts, people who were socialized, and I have in brackets here, to some extent in religion, but then deconverted, right? So that's not to say necessarily that these were all people with deep attachment to a religious life, right? But there's some religious socialization that happened, right? Might have been a lot, might have been pretty minor, but there's just some religious socialization, right? That's basically what they say about the nuns. So most of them, right, were coming from a religious background to some extent, and then deconverted. Okay, so that's not surprising, right? And we kind of see that when we look at the charts from the religious landscape lectures, right? We see our mainline people declining religiously, right? And we see every generational cohort getting somewhat less religious. So we know there's people deconverting, essentially. Okay. Growing cohort, though, of cradle nuns, right? So basically people who were raised with no religion or raised anti-religious, right? So obviously, parents who themselves have sort of left religion are going to somewhat typically raise their kids either simply non-religious and it simply gets no mention, or they might be actively anti-religious, right? That can happen for sure. Yeah, and I mean, what Thiessen and Laflamme say is what I've sort of said a few times here, is that as organized religion plays a smaller and smaller role in other aspects of life, right? As it's less socially central, as someone's social group and their social life isn't as tied up as it was in the past in religion, right? The church, and maybe supporting Chavez's thesis, on religion as a decline, or a secularization as a decline in religious authority. Religion is playing a smaller part in people's lives. Like, it doesn't dominate the center of society anymore. It is one institution for people amongst many. And so leaving a religion becomes a lot more culturally viable in a case like this, right? Basically, you can leave religion with relatively few negative consequences because it just doesn't play, you're not going to be shunned from a community, right? So it's a more viable cultural option. And yeah, I mean, what they suggest is that it kind of creates a snowball rolling downhill sort of effect, right? So, a snowball downhill will kind of gather more snow and get bigger and bigger. Once people start leaving and people see it has no kind of impact on their lives, really, right? They live much as before, at least in most cases. Well, then it's like, well, once you have the example of someone leaving, it becomes more possible to sort of think about it like, okay, what would non-religious life kind of look like, right? Like, and if it's more acceptable, more and more acceptable, more people are probably going to do it, simply because it's more viable, right? It just doesn't seem like that big of a problem. Whereas in the past, right, leaving religion might, if you're someone like, the mother of J.R.R. Tolkien, right, who famously converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism, right? And what happened to her is she was essentially shunned by polite English society. She went from being rather well off to, basically living in poverty, and died of complications from diabetes, had to leave her children in the care of the Catholic Church, right? Like really someone who went all the way down because it mattered, right? Changing your religious affiliation at that time mattered. Today, less so, right? You probably know lots of people who have no religious affiliation or who have deconverted, and their lives are much the same as they were before, right? They're not facing, I would think, tremendously negative consequences. And so, right, it creates a snowball. Well, if they left, I can leave, and so on and so forth. Okay, so like much like that chart from Ryan Bird showed in the religious landscape lectures, the biggest growth of the nuns principally comes from the Protestant mainline, right? And I mean, this is essentially what Glenn Stanton was sort of arguing in his Myth of the Dying Church as well, is that the growth of these, of the nuns has basically come mostly at the expense of mainline Protestants, right, who used to dominate U.S. society. In Canada, a little bit less so. It was more kind of a close 50-50 split between Roman Catholics and mainline Protestants. But the U.S. really used to be dominated by mainline Protestants, right? A really strong percentage, of people in the past would have considered themselves mainline. Those have basically collapsed, as we saw in religious landscape. They've declined very, very quickly, in a relatively short, 40, 50-year process. And they're, a decade away from essentially non-existence, being so small that we essentially can't measure them. Yeah, I mean, we can measure them, but you're not going to see them on statistical charts anymore because it's going to just be like just a tiny fraction of things, right? Catholics and evangelical Protestants have also, or conservative Protestants as they're sometimes referred to, have also contributed, right? We've definitely seen, people leaving those religious groups, though not in as big of numbers. One of the things that we'll see, and as we go through, we're going to talk about Catholics a fair bit. Catholics have tended to, in a lot of ways, be like mainline Protestants. They're over, for being, say, in the U.S., about 20% of the U.S. population, they've over contributed, somewhere around between 30 and 40% of people who consider themselves nuns. So they over contribute to, based on their size, to the phenomenon of the nuns, right? And we'll see towards the end of talking about the nuns, the Catholic kind of generational retention rate, and it's, were you raised, what denomination were you raised in? We'll see that Catholic fares pretty poorly comparatively, right? That a lot of people who were raised Catholic have left. Yeah, I mean, in Canada, Buddhists have also contributed. The shift from Buddhism in some ways to nothing in particular is almost a less difficult one, in that, Buddhists, in some senses, because they don't have like weekly religious practices, right? They're not a congregational faith. The shift into non-religion, sometimes is a relatively seamless one for Buddhists. And I mean, I think there's immigration contributions as well. I mean, people immigrating from, say, mainland China, where religion is essentially a non-factor because the state is officially atheistic. And what religions are there are things like Chinese folk religions and Confucianism have definitely contributed as well, right? I mean, especially if you look at, say, like British Columbia in Canada, or the west coast of the United States, right? California, Oregon, and Washington. You do see, I think, immigration from China playing a role as well, because, and I mean, it's not definitive, and I don't think it's the decisive one, but you definitely do see that people from there essentially are non-religious, principally because they come from a non-religious country, right? Or a country where the religions that are there aren't thought of maybe by the people who live there as religion in the same way as, say, Christianity is. So you do have to take that into account, I think, at the end of the day. Minority faiths, Islam, Sikhism, Hinduism contribute some people to the nuns, but they're such a small percentage of the population that, it's not marked. It may become more so in the future, right? Especially as Muslims, say in Canada, continue to make up a larger and larger share of the population. In the U.S., right, Canada, as I think we saw last time, has become markedly more secular and has many more nuns as a percentage of its population than the United States. And I think at least part of this has to do with a sort of difference in religious makeups between the two countries. Canada essentially, until very recently, had basically no evangelicals. Evangelicals made up a very, very small percentage of the population. Even today, it's probably only, it probably topped out, say in the 1990s, around 11, 12%. And it's sort of stayed around there ever since. As we saw last time, the US, it was about 30% at its peak in about 1993. And this has a bunch of knock-on effects. Evangelicals, until relatively recently, have been much more kind of culturally resistant to deconversion, right? Whether that's because evangelicals have more tight-knit communities, I think that's part of it. The theology is a little bit maybe more comprehensible. They've had more kind of family and youth focus, I think, has been a big part of evangelicalism. It's a little bit more freewheeling as well, right? This is sort of I'm venturing now, I suppose, into my own theories. I think evangelicalism's somewhat freewheeling and entrepreneurial nature has meant that there's more efforts at sort of keeping people, and especially young people, engaged and kind of consistently through, right? So you'll have ministries that'll pop up, things like Focus on the Family. You'll have people like the guys who make Veggie Tales, Big Ideas Productions, making religious products that sort of keep people under that, sacred umbrella that Smith kind of talks about. And evangelicalism has been much better at doing that, whereas I think mainline Protestantism and Catholicism, in their deeply institutionalized forms, have kind of struggled with that, right? Because who gets to speak officially for the mainline or Catholicism? It's essentially the clergy, right? And to form a Lutheran ministry or an Anglican ministry or a Catholic ministry, right, you kind of have to be sanctioned by those churches. If you just want to be, an evangelical that goes and starts your own, cartoon company or your own ministry, all you need is a bit of seed money and some initiative. And so some of that, I think, has made a difference. Evangelicals have that more market-oriented idea, even though they might not phrase it that way. They have that more market-oriented idea, and they're kind of more open to religious innovation. Now, this, I think, also causes problems. You certainly get corruption in industries like contemporary Christian music, where it becomes all about the Benjamins. But nevertheless, you have more kind of religious products, more ways of approaching things. Parachurch ministries, especially at the college and university level, are almost exclusively evangelical. You just don't see much in the Protestant mainline. Catholic, a little bit more. You have things like Focus. But, I think a lot of these are then kind of built on the evangelical Protestant model, right? It's we see what the Protestants are doing, and we kind of copy it. This was the case, back in the early 2000s. Probably the most prominent campus ministry was called Campus Crusade. I think it's called Cru now, and I don't know how prominent it is anymore. But then there were kind of Catholic equivalents, right, where Catholics sort of copied this. Nevertheless, right, I'm off my point a little bit. Evangelicalism and its better retention rate, I think, has slowed down the process of nunnification, if you will, that has been kind of running rampant in Canada. and the US, but in the US it's been a little bit slower because evangelicals have been more culturally resistant to the nun phenomena. So yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, whether that's good news or bad news, I don't know. The good news, I suppose, if you're an evangelical and you think religion matters, if you're a secularist and you would like more secularization, I suppose that's a frustration. But never, and Canada's lack of evangelical presence and the lack of kind of defined evangelical institutions in Canada, I think has caused problems, right? I think it has caused problems where religion has declined much more quickly. Even people looking to potentially remain religious and leave the Protestant mainline as it liberalized and sort of lost its mojo, haven't had a place to go where they have in the U.S. Now that said, I think evangelicalism and non-denominational churches, as we saw on the charts from the census in Canada, is growing pretty robustly. It's actually essentially the only Christian group that is growing. Everything else is shrinking. And so, I mean, they may be moving into that space where people who would like to be religious are increasingly finding, a non-denominational evangelical church. Something like the River Church or Life Church or Celebration Church, or these sorts of things. And they sort of come and go. They, pop up. They're very youth-oriented. They grow old, and then they either regenerate or they die off. So I think we have increasing evidence here, in terms of religious socialization, that those who reported themselves as having no religious affiliation, right, are nuns, essentially, for the most part, like just a bare majority of them, basically came with both parents that had a religious affiliation, and just basically half of them, right? It's not a majority. It's just actually just half attended religious services at least once a month when 12 years old, right? So that the U.S. and Canadian numbers actually look really, really similar, right? Okay, so let's talk about on this chart. What's here? Our nuns, right? So 56% in the U.S. and 55% say both parents had a religious affiliation. And then only half say they attended religious services at least once a month when 12 years old. So that means, you've got a very strong cohort, 44% in the US, 45% in Canada, that either had only one parent with a religious affiliation or where neither parent had a religious affiliation, right? So you're seeing that snowbally effect, right? Where, increasingly there's a bunch of cradle nuns, right? People who were raised without religion. And I mean, formative years, right? So around 12 years old, kind of on the cusp of adolescence, only half of those who end up as religious nuns attended religious services at least once a month, which means, half of them never attended, right? So what you're seeing is less religious socialization happening, right? Fewer even of the nuns, right? There's definitely a strong cohort where some kind of mix of their parents had no religious affiliation, and a pretty strong sense that they didn't attend religious services all that frequently, right? That there's half of them that just never went, right? So how they can't be religiously socialized if they never go. And then the other half, right, at least once a month. We don't know what's inside that data from what Thiessen and Laflamme report. Once a month might not be a lot, right? So definitely we might be seeing, what we would suggest is marginal peel off, right? Where those who are marginally religious to start with or come from marginally religious families are the ones that are peeling off into the nuns. So when does it happen? Like, when do people disaffiliate? Well, principally, it seems that people tend to disaffiliate in that time where you undergo a sort of psychological differentiation from your parents, right? So late adolescence and young adulthood is really the critical time, right? So, we're talking kind of 16 to probably about 23, 24 is the time where most people will disaffiliate from religion. Now, the process is generally referred to as a relatively gradual one. So, what kind of this trajectory looks like, according to Thiessen and Laflamme, is, as you kind of hit around 16, parents start to be less demanding about religious behavior for the most part, right? And their ability to sort of enforce religious behavior becomes more problematic, right? At 16, you're much closer to adulthood, right? Parents, especially in kind of Western cultures, should think that this is a person that can potentially make their own decisions about life, right? About what they want to do in life and how they want to affiliate. Parental, desire in a sense to enforce religious norms also tends to decline a little bit for the most part, right? So, what you essentially get is people then being allowed to more or less make their own choices. And so this is when you tend to get religious disaffiliation. You also get, right, in this period, people going off to college, university, or into another kind of life transition. And this, again, as they're adults, parents are more treating them like adults, less willing and less able to kind of enforce religious behaviors, right? Like once a person is 18, most parents kind of back off, right? They're an adult, they can make their own choices. And this is when that disaffiliation happens. And this is kind of reflected in what the typical experience of it is, right? For most people, it's not this like, what we maybe think of as, the lights going out kind of moment, or the lights going on, depending on which metaphor you want to use, where it's like they just stop, something hits them, right? They read, I don't know, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, and they're like, yes, of course there is no God, and they just disaffiliate. That's not really what tends to happen, right? The disaffiliation tends not to be that ideological, for one, and it tends to just be like they stop attending, right, for whatever reason, right? And it's often busyness, right? College and university gets in the way, or high school friends take precedence, they want to sleep in because, we're an overworked, overtired kind of society in general. So they stop going, and then as they stop attending, it just becomes less important to them, right? It becomes less central to who they are, right? And they skip church 1 week, but then 2 weeks, and then 3 months, and then 6 months. And then before they know it, they're just not, they start to socialize with people who are non-religious more. And over time, right, it just kind of disappears and fades away. So, it's just a gradual falling away, right? It's not like, boom, like a punctiliar kind of event. It's actually one that's just kind of slow and gradual, right? People just kind of drift away from their parents' kind of religious socialization, if they had any, and then, just kind of lose it over time. And that is mostly what it looks like. Yeah, and most mainline Protestants or liberal Catholics experience, what Zuckerman calls mild disaffiliation, which is they were never that interested in it in the first place, right? It was something that was just kind of there in the background. And then when they stopped doing it, it didn't cause them that much trouble, right? They weren't overly religious to start with. It's more or less untroubled. It's just kind of a slow drifting away from the religious faith. And it's not like they have religious trauma. They have really any struggles with it. There's probably things like on an intellectual or ideological level that they disagree with, right? Because, Christianity and other religions in general aren't perfectly aligned with cultural norms, but that's not what's really driving them away, according to Thiessen and Laflamme. It's mostly just a kind of, especially for the liberal Protestants or Catholics, it's kind of like, well, this doesn't matter that much. It doesn't seem most people take it all that seriously, so they just don't take it seriously and they drift away. For formerly evangelical and conservative Catholics, it's a much more transformative and traumatic disaffiliation. It's much more of a they have a break with it for whatever reason, right? And it could be any number of things. But it's much more kind of pronounced, or there's some kind of particular teaching of the religion that they can't align with, or some kind of moment of trauma, something that kind of breaks them with their religious upbringing. It's much more common, right? Because typically, if you're talking about evangelicals and conservative Catholics, especially of the frequently church attending varieties, their parents are much more likely to take it seriously, right? It's probable that they've been religiously socialized in a much deeper way. And so to break those kinds of social bonds requires a lot more, right? So it requires a sort of hard hitting moment. It can be a lot of things, right? It can be a disagreement, it could be abuse, it could be, I've certainly heard kind of secondhand stories of, someone, having their first sexual experience, right? And that sort of putting their religious beliefs into question, right? A lot of these things, right? It happens in lots of different ways, and it's seen as something that's a break, right? A getting together with a non-religious romantic partner can be one that really pushes people away as they, you're kind of naturally align your values with the people you care about and want to be aligned with. And so, if, say, a romantic partner, someone who's potentially, very important to you, is non-religious, like the realignment can be pretty quick and pretty hard. And again, like this often sort of shifts people's belief structures in pretty distinct ways, right? All right.
All right, so when we talk about why people became nuns, basically we can sort of look at a couple of major variables that seem to play a role. All right, so the first one, parents give religious choice to children, right? So parents who were more likely to give children the choice of whether to be religious or not, right? Whether to attend religious services or not, were more likely to report that their children ended up as nuns, or they're more likely to have their children end up as nuns, right? So this thing where parents don't want to force a religious belief on their children will tend to lead to at least some subsection of those people then basically choosing to be nothing in particular, right? Drifting away from religion, right? Moving away slowly, probably, from the family religion, but nevertheless, right, giving them a religious choice tended to, at least in some cases, lead to people becoming nuns. Intellectual disagreements, right? I think there's no real surprise here, right? Particularly around things, I would guess, like LGBTQ questions, right? Questions of things like abortion, probably on some scientific questions like evolution for some subset of people. This matters, right? There's an intellectual disagreement with what the religion believes, and so people move away. Social influences, not surprisingly, right? If you're in a less social environment, you have a lot of friends who are not religious, right? And there's a comparison, I'm going to church on Sundays, they get to sleep in, you know, especially combined with, say, parental choice, this can lead to a sort of religious disengagement. Life transitions, right? Typically, especially in the US, moving away to college, and other big life transitions does tend to decrease religiosity and then potentially lead to someone becoming a nun. Parental divorce, changing cities, right? All of these things that take people out of their normal social networks also plays a role in sort of moving people away. And then irreligious socialization. So for some percentage of people now, we can talk about irreligious socialization, right? They are no longer being brought up religious, right? They're actually being brought up by non-religious parents in a non-religious way. So they're likely to, at least to some extent, mirror the beliefs of their parents, right? So they're not being socialized religiously, they're in fact being socialized irreligiously. And that's showing that we have some cradle nuns. Right. So when it comes down to this question of choice, right, parents who give their teens or preteens a choice of continued religious involvement face the potential that teens or preteens will in fact leave whatever religious congregation or religious belief system they belong to, right? Many will take this opportunity to step away. And in a lot of cases, right, teens and preteens haven't really taken ownership of their belief systems. And so religion has always been something imposed externally. They haven't had a chance to internalize it just yet. So given a chance, between say leisure and attending religious services, some of them will step away. We generally find this right in families with lower religious salience, right, where families aren't as committed to a particular religion. Those who who have high religious salience, who really believe religion is important, are far less likely to allow young people a religious choice until they're properly into adulthood, right? So yeah, infrequent prayer, infrequent interaction with holy text, less frequent religious service attendance, and religion not often discussed. We'll tend to see this kind of choice given. This is a fuzzy line in a sense between disaffiliation and irreligious socialization, right? Are they being, in a sense, socialized irreligiously by marginally affiliated parents? There's a bit of a question here. But yeah, for those with weak affiliation, there's at least enough affiliation for the young person to say, yeah, I'm done with religion, right? I'm done identifying with this particular religious congregation, right? So there's elements of a choice there, right? They are making an active choice. And some proportion of parents seem to think religious socialization is unimportant or only of little importance, right? Marginal kind of attendance themselves, marginal importance. And what you're going to end up seeing is then marginal peel off, right? Those people who are already marginal are going to peel off and become irreligious at the end of the day. So, intellectual disagreements, right? This kind of subcategory. One of the big categories here, of course, is evidence-based science versus faith, right? That there still is this perceived conflict, that there is a disjunct or a conflict between science and religion, right? And this is driven, obviously, there's a long history of this, right? Driven by the sort of fundamentalist Christian split and things like the Scopes monkey trial and the rejection of evolution, right? But this general sense that somehow science disproves religion, and that religion is based on faith, science is based on facts, right? And so there is this I have science, I don't need religion, and this is not an uncommon view at all. Personal experience not aligning with religious or church teachings, again around things like personal liberty questions, sexual orientation and gender identity are big ones. The LGBTQ kind of community and questions around how that matches with religions that aren't always welcoming to these groups, right? These are all questions that sometimes lead people away from religious faith. Religious pluralism. Now, this one I do think is quite interesting because, increasingly, and this, I think if you think to Peter Berger, right, this idea of the sacred canopy of everybody in a society sharing a sort of sacred view and that providing a sort of shelter for the whole community, right, a social structure under which everybody can sort of sit. Religious pluralism, and if we talk about Canada and the US, we're talking about increasingly pluralistic societies. So what do we get when we have increasingly pluralistic societies? Well, there's more religions around, right? You might be friends with someone who is Muslim, who is Hindu, who is Christian, who is another form of Christian, Roman Catholic or Protestant or evangelical or non-denominational, right? You might be friends with all of these people, or other religions, right? There's more than just the ones I listed. You might be friends with these people, and that religious pluralism, in a sense, chews at the base of these plausibility structures of religion. It's easy to maintain the plausibility of a religious system when everybody agrees with that religious system. It gets increasingly difficult the more religious pluralism there is, right? So ties between religions and political parties also can kind of eat away at this. And I think it's pretty obvious, right? We've seen, at least since 2016, but even before then, a sort of subset of people who dislike, say, conservative or Republican politics. And because, certain brands of Christianity are associated, particularly with Republican politics or conservative politics in Canada, people will move away from the religion because of its kind of close ties with that particular political orientation, right? So all of these things, play into, I don't want to be a Republican. I don't want to be in the party of Trump. I don't want to be part of a group that rejects, LGBTQ people. All of these things can play a role in disaffiliation. Okay, so according to Thiessen and Laflamme, mixed faith marriages or faith no faith marriages are not as efficient with regards to religious transmission. And this is something that is extremely well documented, and we'll talk about it more later in the course as well. But people who marry people of other faiths, people who marry someone who has no faith, right, and they have faith, what you're likely to find is that these are arrangements, not always, but quite frequently, that are extremely inefficient with regards to religious transmission generation to generation. And in some senses, right, this is a relatively recent phenomenon. For the bulk of history, people were marrying within in-groups, and marriage had a very different meaning, right? It wasn't as much of an at-will contract based on the presumption that people really, really love each other, and that's the basis of marriage, right? That's a relatively recent invention. And so typically, for most of human history, we haven't had to deal with this question. But now, like in late modernity, right, we have a lot of mixed marriages, right? People of different faiths marrying each other, or someone of faith and no faith getting married, right? But what seems to be the case is that this doesn't necessarily lead to religious transmission. So typically, speaking, two parents that share the same religious convictions and are pushing in the same direction, supporting each other, both committed to a particular view of the world and transmitting that onto their children, are going to have the best chance of doing so, right? And this is completely uncontroversial. If one parent in particular, say, has no faith, right, but they're like, oh yeah, I still support you taking the kids to church or whatever, generally speaking, this doesn't work out. Just because, in a lot of ways, children's religious journeys will often kind of take the path of least resistance. And if there is a sort of disjunct between parental understandings, that in itself is going to lead to, typically children going with the path of least resistance, right? Or kind of exploiting or seeing the disjunct between those two things and kind of taking advantage of it. So generally speaking, these mixed marriages and mixed faith and no faith marriages are more likely to produce nuns than other arrangements. So I think not surprisingly, right, adolescence is a period of religious instability. It is a period where young people are trying to figure out who they are, what their identity is, where things like peers become more important than families in some ways, or at least challenge parents and family for a principal role of importance in the young person's life, right? And it seems to be sort of the linchpin of the development of religious identity, right? It is one of those things that if a person becomes sort of non-religious in adolescence, that's probably the path they're going to take forever. If they remain religious through adolescence, likely that they're going to continue on that path as well, right? And it's a critical time for identity development. Things get really locked in. Adult belief systems are very, very difficult to change. And so once people are locked in, it's not that it doesn't happen. It's not that people don't change their beliefs, after adolescence. It's just far, far less common, right? Okay, so yeah, I mean, young people raised in religious families much more likely to be religious than those raised in non-religious families. I don't think there's anything controversial in that, right? If you're socialized, socialization matters. Your parents, your family socialize you. Being socialized in a religious family gives you, an odd chance, or a good chance rather, of carrying on that religious tradition. But obviously, if you're raised in a non-religious family, you're being socialized probably irreligiously. And so it's unlikely that you're going to pick up religious belief at some point. It does happen, and we'll see, some data on this later on in this section, but it's just not super common, right? It's much less likely than if you're raised in a religious family. Yeah, and children who are living with married biological parents are the most likely to be religious. Again, this is not especially surprising. especially as divorce has become much more common. Marriage has been thought of as a much more at-will kind of legal arrangement than a permanent one. What we increasingly see is just that the people who tend to be married more often are religious people. People who have lasting marriages also tend to be people who define themselves as religious because that's a value that their communities have, right? It's something that they themselves sort of see as extremely important and therefore something that they sort of carry on, right? So marriage, yeah, is a key value in many religious communities, and because of that, right, what you're going to see is religious people tend to be married at a higher rate. Their marriages tend to last longer, and therefore, not surprisingly, they're going to probably care more about socializing their children in religion. And so, yeah, you get more religious people coming out of households with married parents whose the children are biologically related to both of them.
All right, so when we talk about social influences and how that might affect people potentially becoming nuns, I mean, it can play out in two major ways. All right, so parents stop attending and then young people stop attending, right? So parental religiosity, for a variety of reasons, declines and maybe they stop attending. I mean, this could be all sorts of things. It can be religious trauma. It can be rejection by the community. I mean, weirdly, one of the things I think that we've often assumed is that as people get older, they get more religious, but that isn't actually necessarily the case. I mean, sometimes what we'll actually see is that when people have really young children, they might think that religion is very important, right? They might think of it as important for giving their young people, their children, a kind of moral foundation, right? A basic, like, you know, if you're nice, how to be nice, how to get along in the world, and they think religion is something that ultimately does that. And as their children get older, right, they start to not really see that as particularly important, right? It's like, okay, well now they're fully socialized, right? They're in, maybe mid to late teens. We've done our bit on moral formation, and if you're not sort of deeply embedded in the social network of a community, you might then sort of transition out. And that's, I think what we see happening. Parents stop attending for a variety of reasons, and as people get older, they're actually often reduce their religious activity. Not because, they're not worried about the hereafter or anything like that, but just that, whatever, they may have been going for very transactional reasons, I guess would be the takeaway. Often, even parents are going for quite transactional reasons that they may not be deeply religiously committed, but they think there's something in religion that might be good for their kids. Okay, so that's one of the paths. And then young people start spending time with others who don't share their faith commitments, right? Especially in pluralistic societies where most people tend to go to public schools rather than religiously based schooling. You're going to find that, as you get older, your peers are probably not going to be people who ultimately share your faith commitments, right? Your family might be more religious than theirs. And so as you start spending time with other people, right, you get diversity of ideas, diversity of ways of living, romantic partners in particular. Maybe people start becoming sexually active, and that can put a wedge, right? All these sorts of things ultimately can lead to a reduction in religiosity over time with young people. So, when we're talking about life transitions, right, things like changing jobs, moving, going to university, particularly if you move to go to university, right? So people who leave home to attend university, right, that is a much bigger disruption than simply going to university, right? So, if you travel, and this is more typical, I think, of an American experience than a Canadian one. If you travel, across the country, move from Idaho to Florida to go to university, right? That's a big disruption in your life. Parental divorce, So your parents getting divorced. We'll talk about this again when we get a little bit later in the course. This is sometimes referred to as sacred loss, right? When parents get divorced, oftentimes young people will experience a sense of what's called sacred loss because they had sort of connected religion and their parents' religion and their parents' marriage with the sacred, right? So they can experience a sort of breakdown of their own faith as they, as their parents' marriages fall apart. Their own divorce, right? If you're a little bit older and you get divorced, this can be a catalyst. The death of a religious family member, and this is really true. And again, we'll look at this in a little bit further detail later on in the course. The death of a religious family member, this can be parent. Most often, I think mom is the more common one. Mom or dad, sometimes a grandmother, right, or a grandfather, grandparents, especially if that person was the religious catalyst in a person's life, right? It was your grandma who took you to church, right? It was your grandma who, prayed with you or whatever it happens to be because they were the catalyst in your life that, was your biggest connection to religion. Their death can be a moment where people disconnect from religiosity. And then busyness, which I say is not really a life transition, but especially as people move into that emerging adult kind of phase, right? Maybe start having children or certainly, start working. And I've seen, a lot of students sort of reflecting on this in their own religious lives. That it's like busyness, needing to work more, that kind of takes them away from religion, right? From their religious faith, that it's this kind of busyness and this need to I don't know, keep up with the Joneses is maybe not the right term, but that is sort of how I think of it. That it's not really a life transition, but it's more a phase of life. And there are moments in life where you are very, very busy. And university, for a lot of young people may very well be that moment, right? Where you're studying, right? Taking 4 or 5 classes, maybe trying to work in order to pay your tuition or just have a little walking around money. It doesn't leave a lot of time for something like, attending religious services or praying even, or looking at holy texts or whatever it happens to be. So when we look at our cradle nuns, right, those raised without a religious affiliation, what we find is not surprising, right? Basically, those raised without a religious socialization will tend not to be religious. Not surprising, right? If you're raised not really being exposed to religion, there's really no way for you to become religious. I mean, not no way, but it's much more difficult. An aversion to forcing beliefs on children is a strong predictor of irreligious socialization, right? So parents who are very, I would say, maybe classically liberal, who want children to make up their own minds about what they believe, are far, far more likely to have children who are nuns, right? This makes sense, right? Yeah, generally, if you don't want to force ideas on people, how are they going to be introduced to them? Yeah, I mean, secular people tend to value nonconformity, right? We see this with a lot of, there's a lot of emphasis in Canadian society, especially and amongst certain sectors of the population on nonconformity. And yeah, child rearing philosophies tend towards nonconformity, independence, anti-authoritarianism, and personal independence amongst those who are more secular, right? And that, again, isn't surprising. So you're going to get people who are a little bit more nonconformist. Yeah, hands-off approaches, like just being like, okay, figure out what you want on your own, is going to impart a certain set of values in and of itself, saying, in a sense, these aren't even really important questions, right? We don't care enough to tell you what we think is true as parents, right? If we're being hands-off, it's like, oh, well, why don't you figure out what you believe about religion? Well, if you don't think it's important enough to teach me, then I'm probably not going to think it's important enough for me to go and learn it, right? And it's not like religion is an especially easy thing to just pick up, right? They're complex, culturally embedded systems that can seem very unfamiliar. Okay, what's on this chart on the slide, right? Basically, you see that people with no religious affiliation right? Far more likely to have at least one parent with no religious affiliation in the US and Canada, almost half, and never attended religious services when they were growing up, about a quarter in each country, right? And then the religiously affiliated, far less likely to have one parent with no religious affiliation and far less likely to say they had never attended religious services.